right, we're live and we're so excited. Welcome everybody to the Wangren Lecture Series at Northwind Manor. It's so good to have you here. I am Dave Bruno, the Executive Director at the Rabbit Room. Wonderful privilege that I have. And the Rabbit Room is a ministry we believe deeply in the power of the arts to bring Christian communities close together. And we believe, of course, that when Christians are thriving and flourishing together, that's good for the entire world. So we program a lot of activities, lectures like tonight. We have a monthly concert series we call The Local Show. We have an annual conference called Hutchmoot, and much, much more, which you can learn about at our website, rabbitroom.com. And there, if you'd be so interested, we also explain our membership program, which allows you to support the ministry of the Rabbit Room if you were led to do that, which we would really appreciate. Tonight, we have Zack Eswine with us, and he's going to speak to us about Jesus' Artistry of Doubt, which I'm really excited about. After the lecture, we'll have a brief conversation, time for Q&A. But let me introduce Zack, and then we'll invite him up here. Zack serves as the lead pastor of Riverside Church in Webster Groves, Missouri, just outside of St. Louis. He's an author of several books. He and his wife, Jessica, also co-founded a ministry called Sage Christianity, which creates hospitable spaces to bring honest questions into conversation with the wisdom of Jesus. That sounds like a really good ministry. So please help me welcome Zack. Thank you.
There we go, to say hello and bring you greetings from our family. And I come at this question about artistry as a person by temperament, seeking to own the fact that I enjoy and love various kinds of artistry, especially with words and music. And also I come at the question of doubt because I have a long history of it in my own family system, in my own life, and then the daily work that I'm part of in local ministry life. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to think together about Jesus as a storyteller and the language for doubt that he gives us in some of his stories. And so to begin that, I thought I had read something called 7 Novels About Losing Faith in Religion. It was written by Kelsey McKinney, and Kelsey says this. She says, "I believed the stories of the Bible more than I believed anything else for the majority of my life. I lost the most influential book in my life the minute I lost my faith. There isn't much scripture to tell you how to stop believing, and it was hard for me to find stories to help understand and survive my experience. There weren't many novels about wondering whether everything you'd ever believed was a lie." Well, I read this and felt a real kinship with Kelsey. I don't know her, but one of the reasons I felt a kinship with her, and I wonder how you would feel, is that I want to make sense of my faith too. And I have questions too, and want to be able to sort those questions out like she wanted to. And I also resonate with where she's turning to find help for her doubts. She's turning to stories. And there's this interesting book called The Novel Cure, 751 Books to Cure What Ails You. So it's whatever you might be experiencing, you look it up and it recommends 5 or 6 novels for your ailment. And under the heading Loss of Faith, it says this, the loss of faith can mean that the light goes out of your life. At such times we need novels to return us to the tenets we need to uphold if we're going to go forward with joy and confidence. And I thought, boy, I resonate with that. Looking for stories when the light goes out of our life that can help us recover a sense of joy and confidence. I was thinking about, are there any stories that have done that by way of introducing as we're moving toward the stories of Jesus? And I was thinking of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which some people love and I'm not probably one of them, but one of the things that is so powerful, or I should say, I love abridged versions of Moby Dick. I'm sorry to our purists. We'll talk afterward. But wonderfully, Melville gives us language for doubt through the character Ishmael. And in one of those places, he talks about divine intuitions. And he says this in the story: "And so, through all the thick mists and dim doubts in my mind, divine intuitions now and then shoot and kindle my fog with a heavenly ray. And for this I thank God, for all have doubts, but few along with them have intuitions. Doubts of all things earthly and intuitions of some things heavenly. This combination makes neither believer nor infidel, but makes a man who regards them both with equal eye." I appreciate language. Those of us who've experienced doubt in the absence of God, and those of us who sometimes experience doubt with a sense of wonder that maybe God is still alive, and the differences between the two. And there's Melville giving us language for it, and what a help it is. But also stories give us language, but they also help give a hospitable access, with our doubt. I was sitting with a young man who was burdened by his doubts and questions, and the clues that I offered to him seemed no help. I noticed that during our conversation, the young man was periodically looking at a picture on the wall. It was as if there was a bothersome fly buzzing around the room, distracting our talk. And "What's that picture?" he finally said, interrupting himself. And I said, "Well, that's from the novel Les Miserables." I said, "My daughter gave it to me as a gift. Do you know this story?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, there was this man named Jean Valjean. And he was a convict, and he stole candlesticks from a man of God. And Valjean was later caught by the police for stealing those candlesticks. And he stood before the priest to verify him as the thief. And instead, the priest told the police that there must be some mistake. The priest had given these candlesticks to Valjean. The man is no thief. In fact, he forgot to take with him these other items of silver, which I'm glad to return to him. The picture," I said, "portrays the moment of grace and mercy in which a thief was forgiven and renamed an honest man." And at that point, it was like a crack of light tributaried through a tiny crease of creek bed within the closed tree line of his thoughts. Drips of light began to slake his thirst in a way my 90 minutes of trying to answer questions had made no progress. And all of a sudden, we were in a different place having a different conversation. I'm resonating with Kelsey is what I'm getting at. The language that stories give us, the hospitable access that it gives us. I don't know if it's true for her, but a lot of us who've grown up in Christian churches, we can feel that we already know what Jesus or the Bible has to say. And so when we begin to doubt, we tend to look to the voices of doubt, assuming we already know what Jesus or the Bible might say. And I have experienced this in my own life. We sort of, when doubt knocks down the power lines of our souls, we go sifting through drawers and closets, searching for candles and batteries to illumine the inner life outside of the Bible. It's easier to become a Christian, someone once said, when I'm not a Christian, than to become a Christian when I am one. Tonight I want to say something that Kelsey didn't seem to find in her journey, in her story. And that was, she didn't seem to find a story in the Bible that could help her with her doubt. And what I'd like to do is suggest there are many, but just one tonight, particularly in the Bible in general, but particularly in the short stories that Jesus tells. So I'd like to look at one of those stories and notice Jesus as an artist, and then notice how Jesus is inviting us into the experience of doubt in the midst of his story, and then to see what we make of that. And so let's hear the story. And it goes like this. A farmer went out to plant some seeds, As he scattered them across the field, some seeds fell on a footpath, and the birds came and ate them. Other seeds fell on shallow soil with underlying rock. The seeds sprouted quickly because the soil was shallow. But the plants soon wilted under the hot sun, and since they didn't have deep roots, they died. Other seeds fell among thorns that grew up and choked out the tender plants. Still other seeds fell on fertile soil, and they produced a crop that was 30, 60, even 100 times as much as has been planted. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. Well, a lot of people didn't understand, and some of them came to ask Jesus what he meant. It's intriguing to recognize that of the stories that Jesus tells us, most of them he doesn't interpret. So if you're listening and you hear his story, he lets you make meaning from it and gives you hospitable time. Some authors don't like to explain their work, but in this case, Jesus did. Some folks came and they said, "We don't understand. Could you explain this story to us?" This is what Jesus said. When anyone hears news of the kingdom and doesn't take it in, it just remains on the surface, and so the evil one comes along and plucks it right out of that person's heart. This is the seed the farmer scatters on the road. The seed cast in the gravel, this is the person who hears and instantly responds with enthusiasm, but there is no soil of character, and so when the emotions wear off and some difficulty arrives, there's nothing to show for it. The seed cast in the weeds is the person who hears the kingdom news, but weeds of worry and illusions about getting more and wanting everything under the sun strangle what was heard, and nothing comes of it. The seed cast on good earth is the person who hears and takes in the news and then produces a harvest beyond the wildest dreams. Let's take a moment now and think about what the theme of Jesus' story might be, and we're on dangerous ground there, at least with Flannery O'Connor. She wouldn't like the question. She'd want to reframe it. She would say it this way: the meaning of a story has to be embodied in it, has to be made concrete in it. A story is a way to say something that can't be said in any other way. It takes every word in the story to say what the meaning is. You tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. When anybody asks, what is a story about, the only proper thing is to tell them to read the story. The meaning of fiction is not abstract meaning, but experienced meaning. And the purpose of making statements about the meaning of a story is only to help you experience that meaning more fully. So we can ask the question, well, what is the meaning that Jesus is inviting us into in his story? And we get a hint about it when not in the story itself, apparently, but in his explanation. He makes it clear. When anyone hears the news of the kingdom and doesn't take it in, this is what Jesus explains about his story. Which is to say, when we come to this story, we're dealing with people who've heard about God, but then doubt the God they've heard about. There's a barrier between them and the news about God they've heard. And this story invites us to experience that meaning. So let's think about Jesus as an artist for a moment. And as an artist, let's notice first that this imagery of soil and seeds, a farmer sowing the seed and things like that, Jesus is drawing upon a long conversation of other artists who have gone before him. In the biblical tradition that foreshadows him, and some of us believe that he fulfills. He is drawing upon imagery that others have used. Here's what one scholar says: the imagery of God as sower and of the people of the world as various kinds of soil was standard in Jewish circles. The idea of the word or teaching of God as being sown is likewise pervasive in pre-Christian Jewish literature, both inside and outside of the Bible. The metaphors of bearing fruit, falling on stony ground, having no root, or being choked by thorns are so obviously applicable to people as well as to plants, and the interpretation ascribed to Jesus. Quintilian used thorns as examples of impediments to learning, while Sirach likened the children of the ungodly to plants with unhealthy roots on sheer rock that put out few branches. Even the birds, as Satan, fit in with their role as harbingers of evil in the Old Testament and intertestamental literature. What we mean is in the fullness of his humanity, Jesus is drawing on a long conversation. He's using images that are not only suited to his agrarian hearers, but also rich with meaning in a long poetry about God. The other thing we want to notice is that sometimes Jesus tells stories in which the presence of God isn't hinted at or in the background, but is right up front. I mean, think of his story. One of his stories is about a man consumed by materialism who wants to build a future life for himself. And in that story, God is a character. And God just speaks to the man, "You fool, tonight you will die." This is one of Jesus' stories. Or you could think of another one of Jesus' stories about the rich man and Lazarus, and both of them die. And they end up having conversations with Father Abraham. You know, in these kinds of stories that the Lord tells puts God front and center right in the story. And so we might think of Wise Blood by Flannery O'Connor. The character Hazel Motes is a preacher who opposes God and rails against Jesus, but Hazel is haunted. And this is how Flannery captured it. He saw Jesus move from tree to tree in the back of his mind, a wild, ragged figure, motioning him to turn around and come out into the dark, where he was not sure of his footing, where he might be walking on the water and not know it, and then suddenly drown. That's Flannery O'Connor, telling a story in which God talk is front and center in the story. Lots of stories like that. Jesus can tell stories like that too. But what's interesting is sometimes he doesn't. And the story we've just heard is an example of that. Jesus is talking about God, doubt, and faith, and yet none of those words are mentioned in his story. A question. What's it like to imagine writing a story about God, doubt, and faith in which those words are explicitly used? God, doubt, and faith. Songs that we write, stories that we tell, poems that we imagine, fables that we create, and God is front and center as a word in it. And then to think about what's it like to write a story about God, doubt, and faith in which God, doubt, and faith are not mentioned. And what would be the advantages and disadvantages of either approach? Jesus takes both approaches. It would be an interesting study to find some clues. I wonder why he takes which approach when. In this, could you imagine a story about doubt that doesn't use the word doubt or God? What advantage might that be for someone in conversation with Jesus? The disadvantages I would feel from my upbringing would be, well, what if someone misunderstands? What if they don't get it? And yet there we're left with Jesus' bewildering willingness to let folks walk away and let things work on them. It's interesting that there are about 3 different kinds of folks who would hear Jesus' story, the stories that he told. One kind of person would just make no sense of it. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And the person like, I don't understand a thing this teacher is talking about. And they dismiss the story and move on. But imagine another person. They heard the story that day. They've left, but the story hasn't left them. They grow more attentive to farms and farmers because of the story. They grow more attentive to birds and weather and the troubles that afflict both. Over time, perhaps they recognize these troubles with farming and they start to think about how they resemble life's troubles. And once they begin thinking of the field as not just a piece of physical earth, but also a metaphor for our lives, the door then opens for considering God and what it can be like to consider His existence and His words. I was dabbling with a little story this past week, and I'm having a little dialogue with a little black ant named Smither in the story. And it's just for fun. I'm dabbling. But here's what happened. The rest of the week, I have seen black ants. I've seen them. And I don't think I would have seen them before. There's something about a story, about a bird and a seed, a farmer and a soil, that draws our attention to them if we're paying attention. And we see them again. They were right in front of us, but the story helps us see them again. And some of those folks, that might be as far as they go. But for others, they begin to think, wow, is there more to this? And something is stirring within them. They have questions. And then they go to the author, Jesus, and they say, tell us more. What did you mean? And the story functions this way. And so here's Jesus giving hospitable time for people with his story. He can tell a story that's explicitly God inhabited, or you wouldn't even know it's about God. The author knows it's about God, but we don't. And he's willing to allow us to make meaning of it. He's also willing to let us walk away and not understand it and look for another author. And that's not easy to do as an artist who's human. And here is Jesus doing that. But what I'd love to think about now is what are the reasons we doubt? Because this is what Jesus is wrestling with in his story. The reasons that people doubt God. And so let's take a look at some of it. One thing that goes overlooked, it's so small in the story. It's the smallest thing in the story. It's the seed in the story. And it seems like, as a writer, our Lord Jesus, he is Lord to me. He may not be for you. That language comes right out of my heart, but I recognize not everyone might be in that place. I'd love to be in a hospitable conversation about that. But for myself, I think that's a weak metaphor. You're standing right there in the Roman Empire. People are crucified on the streets. You're telling a story to a minority people beneath the oppression of that empire. And the metaphor that you choose to describe your God and your kingdom is a seed. I mean, it seems like he should have had a legion of giant eagles or something. He should have had some type of ferocious metaphor as a storyteller to describe his movement and the God that he's talking about in contrast to the Roman world, particularly the audience Jesus is telling his stories to. I've wondered about that. One of the things that some scholars have pointed out is that it seems like in Jesus' stories, sometimes he concedes his critics' point of view by giving his critics a voice in his stories. One prime example is the story of the son who runs away and the son who stays in the home. The son who runs away squanders everything, loses everything, and eventually finds himself in a pig slough with pigs. Jesus' critics would have believed that a person was unclean. They would be characterized as being with pigs. And so Jesus gives language to that point of view right there in his story. And he says, as if to say in the story, you're right. This person is unclean. But there's more to the story. And so where his critics would stop their narrative, Jesus goes there with them, but then picks up where they won't go and tells a fuller story about a person who was once unclean, who doesn't have to stay that way. In this case, what would it be like if Jesus, what if Jesus, in the artistry of what he's doing, is just humbly conceding the point of how weak he looks? The kingdom that he's talking about seems so impotent compared to the Roman soldiers who are on their horses or standing nearby as he tells his stories. And so he chooses this humble metaphor of a seed. Celsus, one of the earliest Roman critics of Christianity, balked at this kind of thing. Not this particular story, but the kind of thing. And he says things like this: taking its root in the lower classes, the religion, Christianity, continues to spread among the vulgar. Nay, one can say it even spreads because of its vulgarity and the illiteracy of its adherents, so that wherever one finds a crowd of adolescent boys or a bunch of slaves or a company of fools, there will the Christian teachers be. What is this Roman critique? Well, he goes on and on about various things, but one of the threads running through Celsus's critique of Christianity is its weakness. Jesus seems to put it front and center in the story. What's it like for an artist talking about doubt and God to give language to the critic's point of view in the story? To say, it does look weak. It's like a seed that a bird could eat and snatch away. There's a short story by Arthur Powers. It's called Padre Raimundo's Army. And Pastor Raimundo is brutally gunned down on his way to advocate for a victim of injustice. And besides the 3 men who murdered him, only 2 witnesses saw what happened, and both were old, so no one believed them. The official report was that no one saw what happened. But the locals heard the old ones tell that when the bullets rang out, as Padre Raimundo was falling to breathe his last breath, he raised his arm and motioned forcefully forward as if he was a commander, waving troops at his heels to advance beyond him. Though the leaves on the mango tree remained still, the old ones testified that a great wind swept up toward the jail which Padre Raimundo was confronting. And the door to the cell opened, and the innocent man walked out freely. And what of the 3 murderers assaulted by the wind after they gunned down the innocent man? One sat in a lump for days, muttering, I'm sorry, to no one in particular. He vanished, and no one ever saw him again. The other was committed to a state hospital. He clings to medical staff, fearing for his life. Don't let them, they're coming, he says. And when asked who is coming, the spooked man begins to describe golden swords. The third went silent for 6 months. Afterward, he resigned his post, and since then has given his life to feeding the poor. A story has a way of talking about power and the great reversal of it. Whether it's Padre Raimundo or Tolkien's hobbits, a power of a different kind, an unexpected, seemingly small kind, creates a shocking reversal. And as an artist, Jesus loves stories with seeds in them. He tells more than one. And sometimes we doubt God because he uses power in a way that seems weak. And our experience of it, it seems small. And we think that God is like a lovely grandpa, beloved and very dear to us, but needs our help using an iPad. He just doesn't seem to have the power to handle my own technology, and for all his love, doesn't have the power to handle the things of the world that are upon my shoulders. And so we feel the weakness of it. And Jesus, as a storyteller, just comes right into them and says, you're right. It looks really weak. But the Christian artist continues to find metaphors that say, yes, I see what you say and why you say it, but that isn't the whole of it. What if there's more? And then shows this great reversal. And so Chanticleer and Walt Wangren's trilogy must learn again that humility, love, faithfulness to the canonical hours of ordinary days, these small treasures are more powerful than the dark whispers of Worm's power upon the waves. Worm and his dark whispers upon the waves counsel the rooster to choose the very humble things, to let go of the very humble things that he held on to begin with, and to choose the very means of power that nearly destroyed him to begin with. He has to come back to the seed and see it. I mean, we all love underdog stories. That's what we're saying in a crass way. Jesus is giving us an underdog story about how we doubt God because it seems powerless, and how things turn in the end. The next bit we often overlook, not because it's a small seed, but I think because the way our English words function in translation. And it's the Christian artist, the dealing with evil, and the great question that causes so many of our profound doubts. The question that Jesus himself, after telling these stories, will one day ask on the cross, my God, why? It's that question. And we see it here in the story. Some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. It's that word, devoured. And then when Jesus explains the passage, the story, he says the evil one comes and snatches away what's been sown in his heart. And there's a gruesome image taking place here. And I want to try to highlight it for you. The Greek word used for this word devour, it means to consume, to eat up entirely, to utterly destroy. Listen to how one of Jesus' other students used this same word. He says this, behold, he's talking about a vision in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour her. There's a horror in this scene of Jesus' story, but it's in the language. He lets it be more subtle in the language when he tells the story. What's intriguing to me that I want to know about, why, when he's asked about it, does he go ahead and let the cat out of the bag and heighten the horror? Because he says what this is the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. So let's look at the first part. He snatches away. This word has the idea of taking by force, tearing to pieces. Jesus uses this word in other of his stories. One of those stories is this. Jesus talks about a good shepherd in contrast to a hired hand. The hired hand runs when the wolves are coming after the sheep, to snatch the sheep and scatter them. It's the same word. That is, to snatch is what the wolf does to a sheep when the hired hand abandons the sheep and the wolf is free to do its violence upon it. If we're not catching it yet, then it's the image itself. The first image is the story itself, a bird devouring, consuming, utterly destroying a seed. That's a disproportionate image. A little seed, a bird devouring it. Now, when Jesus explains it, the little bird is a picture of the evil one who comes and takes by force, snatches away what's been sown in his heart. In his heart. The image here is of a bird ripping out something from a human being's living heart. It is of the evil one in real time, taking by force and plundering what has been put within the beating heart. It is a scene that's subtle and horrific, violent. In his acclaimed novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, James Baldwin pictures a pastor father who abuses his wife and children. Escalating into rage, the pastor father's sister confronts him, and the raging pastor rebukes his sister for using foul language in front of the children. "Don't you worry about my language, brother," she says. "You better start worrying about your life. What these children hear ain't going to do them near as much harm as what they see." "What they see," his father muttered, "is a poor man trying to serve the Lord. That's my life." "Then I guarantee you," she said, "that they are going to do their best to keep it from being their lives. You mark my words." Often if you were to read commentaries on this passage, often this scene of the bird ripping out, devouring, the evil one ripping out and devouring, is captured as an enticement. The devil is tempting us. And I want to suggest to you that that's more like a later scene in this story, with like weeds that choke out things, with worries and with the love of good things that money can provide. The commentators want to cast this scene as the one ring, shiny in front of us, and we take it and call it my precious, and then we're enslaved, to the evil one. But this scene is first of all violent, and second of all, the seed is passive. A seed has been placed there by something else. The seed, it lays where it was placed. And the devouring and the consuming and the utter destroying is a forcible action that the seed isn't seeking, but is brought upon it and shaking it away. What if what we're dealing with here, this is why folks, when they hear the kingdom message, they don't understand it. Because they've either experienced firsthand some type of evil devouring in a demonic way, devilish way, or they've experienced what David Brooks called moral injuries. Evil through the hands of others has been perpetrated upon them to devour them, consume them, and utterly destroy them. This is more like Job's wife in the throes of being devoured. Everything she loves being devoured. She just says, "Curse God and die." And she says it in her pain. She doesn't stay there in the story, but that's where she is in the story. What if this is more like John the Baptist in prison? The one who stood up and declared, "Behold the Lamb of God." Now in prison, and facing that kind of threat, he sends word to Jesus, "Are you the one, or should we look for another?" There is a kind of doubt we experience, a way that we can't make sense of God when we're looking at the violence of evil in the world and what it does to us. Jesus is giving us so far the experience in his story of doubting God because of power, and how could a seed be powerful enough? And doubting God because of the moral injuries that human beings experience by evil. More quickly now, the hardships that follow him. At first glance, You know, this plant that grows up and it flourishes for a while, but then it has no root and it withers away. At first glance, we could think maybe this is fear, because Jesus, when he explains it, he says, you know, because of persecution or because of difficulty on behalf of the word, they wither away. If that were the case, we would think of the novel Silence, or we would think of Graham Greene's Whiskey Priest, afraid of physical harm in the story The Power and the Glory. But I wonder if it's not that, or at least it's more than that. And it's because of this word being used, fall away. When Jesus says they fall away, it's this word from which, the Greek word from which we get the word scandal. Scandalon. And the way this word is used has to do with taking offense, being offended. And what if it's that there was an expectation that when we believed in God and with great joy we received that news, there was an expectation that life would be smooth. It's not so much about the evil question, but just the fact that there's no incentive. If people find out that we believe or follow in God, it's an offense. And we ourselves become offended that God expects us to receive and cultivate His resources so that we could be deep-rooted in the midst of the scorching heat of the afternoon. And when there is no water, there are resources within, God-given, that enable us to handle that. And instead we want it to be, should it have to be that way? Why wouldn't it be that God just wouldn't have any hard times? There is no heat of the day. There is always water. Why is it like that? And over time, though we started with great joy, over time we become offended. Intriguingly, this is the thing Jesus says when John the Baptist sends people to ask him, you know, are you the one or should we find another? Jesus defends John's character, and then he says this, blessed is the one who's not offended by me. It's the same word. And he's saying that for John's sake too. John started out wonderfully. Now he's facing the scorching heat of an afternoon where there is no water. And he's starting to question, are you the one? And Jesus says, blessed is the one who's not offended by me. God and His willingness to allow us to learn endurance becomes a scandal, and we let it go, and we walk away. God seems weak and without the kind of power needed in the real world. God doesn't stop evil. God doesn't stop hard times. He doesn't stop His people from being poorly thought of. And for these reasons, we doubt. And finally, there's the happy secureness, right? There's the care and anxiety that we have, or there's the happiness that we have. And the reason someone might doubt God, not get it, when they hear the news of Him is because they're afraid or because they're happy. And either way, this idea of weeds choking out, crowding it all out, it's more like Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, being crowded out. This idea of God and the search. Or it's Dickens' Scrooge, or it's Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. We have lots of stories here. It's C.S. Lewis and how he begins to talk about Susan and Susan's journey as a queen of Narnia. And this all brings us to the final scene of this story where there's faith. And what I find helpful here is it's possible to see them in contrast, in stark contrast. Well, there's the folks, who doubt God for these reasons, and then there are the faithful ones, who bear fruit. But there's a key word in there that Jesus describes those who by patience have borne fruit. And it's a flowing out of the other scenes in the story, as if they're all connected. And what we're being left with is the picture of a person of faith. And this faith is hard fought for. It's the person believing, having experienced the apparent weakness of God in the raging world. It's the person believing, having experienced the evil that has tried to devour the world, devour a generation, devour their own life, the moral injuries they've experienced. It's a person believing in the midst of the offense that they felt with God in the heat of the day when there was no water, and they were being asked to walk with God rather than that heat to be removed. And it's a person who's believed in the midst of their great anxieties and their great anxious fears about the world. And they've, in spite of the love of good things and happy things that money provide, they're still believing. It's this picture of a survivor, a picture of someone against all odds who's bearing fruit. And bearing fruit with what? That little seed. And in that, we're invited in to make meaning of faith in a way that isn't trite, but a veteran faith, an experienced faith, one who's been through it. And you would say to them, how is it you still believe? And they would say, I don't know. Except, and then they begin talking about these resources they had in the heat of the day when there was no water. And somehow, in the midst of being devoured and almost utterly destroyed, there was something that sustained them. And then they would be talking about this grace with God, bearing fruit. Well, to close, we learned how an artist engages our experience with doubt and faith by means of a story. We learned that this story needn't use the words God, doubt, or faith, or it can, but it needn't, and it can begin a conversation. And when asked for, it can find an explanation that's more explicit about God and doubt and faith. And by means of a story, Jesus enables us to experience why we doubt God and what one has endured who has faith and bears fruit. In Jesus' hands, artistry of doubt is like an ancient and enchanted match, if there could be such a thing, whose power to strike fire has never worn out with use, but to this day remains able to ignite an ashen soul into a fire glow. With the dynamo of original breath, Jesus can speak life into the burnt leftovers of charred and tombed wood. Jesus can say to faith that died, come forth. And the faith that comes forth flickers into orange, consoling embers, and sometimes unforeseen flickers into a blaze. But we're talking about a match the whole time. Like a story, a match is a tiny thing. It's forgotten and lost in a coat pocket, which hangs unchosen and unworn in the back of a closet. Like a story, a match appears to have no light within itself until it makes contact. Even then, once struck, a match offers a light seemingly so small and so temporary as to leave no trace of its illuminant except a wispy white smoke that's gone in a moment. But later, if someone enters that room where the match once struck, she will smell the remains of a fire she cannot see, a smoke that has gone, and she will become curious, and she'll ask her friends who are with her, was someone here? Did something burn here once? Did this room once know light? And somewhere the one who lit the match remembers too. For who can forget what the fire is like if in the dark what you held on to and struck was your last chance at light? Stories are like that. especially stories in the hands of Jesus. Why don't we stop there? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
We'll bring those over here. Um, Thank you. Wow.
Thank you.
How about if we take a seat right here, and
All right.
I'm going to start us off with a bit of a conversation, a few questions, but then we'll open it up
Okay.
to everybody else as well. I was taking notes, but I didn't get your bibliography, which I want. You referenced a lot of stories, so I'm so grateful for that. And it makes me think too. Tell us a little bit about your life. I'm kind of wondering about the interplay of stories and doubt in your own life. Did the stories come first and the love of reading? Were they something that you went to in times of doubt?
I think early on I'd turn to songs. Songs that are explicit about God and songs that aren't, but that are dealing with that. Even to this day, like Sting's most recent album, he has this incredible, he's not a follower of Jesus, but he has this incredible song called The Bells of St. Thomas, in which, with all the skill of his craft, he is grappling with this question of doubt and faith. And I find myself helped. So that's where I would turn to. But along the way, as I've gotten older, I've realized how much I love stories, not just in song, but in books too, and poems, especially poems that invite us into a story of some kind. And I think those things have probably helped me come back to the true story of all things as I see it, especially the stories Jesus tells us. Mm-hmm.
You say come back to, and I'm curious if you'd be willing to share some of your experiences with doubt, because you have been a follower of Jesus for a long time, but it sounds like you've also wrestled with doubts.
Yeah, but I come from a really broken family experience, and so each of my parents were married 3 times, and so there's a lot of blended family stuff there. And then some of those living rooms I would live in growing up, one set of them believed there was a God, and the other set of those living rooms doubted. They wouldn't have used the word deconstruct back then, but doubted there was a God, or could be hostile toward God, or certainly it's not the Christian view of God. And so the confusion of that back and forth has made seeing difficult. And I've been drawn always from an early age to Jesus. There's a verse in the book of Hebrews. I don't understand everything in the book of Hebrews, but it's Hebrews 5:7. In the days of Jesus' life on earth, he prayed with loud cries and tears, and he was heard. And I needed that kind of person. I wanted, if God was like this, there was a hospitality toward tears. And so the nature of my doubts have been more in the realm of pain and tears and how to account for them. Not just my own, but, in the world. And I think Dostoevsky in Brothers Karamazov, when I finally read this, I only started to read it because I was told, you got to read this book, and for all these years, and so I finally started. And I had to put it down because he gives the voice to the problem of evil in such an unflinching way. You experience not the weakest objection, but the strongest objection to God in light of that. And I couldn't read that rest of that book for a long time. I was just so shaken by the experience. I feel that experience too, and what to make of it. And so that I have not had the same kinds of doubts sometimes say about, is the Bible reliable? I've had those questions, and I've not doubted that God exists, and I know that's a very real doubt for some people, and I learn a lot from folks who experience that. But I have doubted that God is good, and what to make of that. And so, yeah, these stories have been, songs, poems, stories have been really helpful. I think someone like a Eugene Peterson, later in life, helped me see the biblical storyline rather than just pulling out verses for various things. Yeah.
When you were telling a story about your reactions to Brothers K, it strikes me that it takes courage to doubt.
Mm-hmm. It really does.
And I wonder if there's an element of our very broad brushstrokes here, culture or church experiences that kind of don't give us the permission to have that courage. If that's something that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
In conversations of doubt.
Yeah, I think I can see that. We get afraid. That's part of it. We get afraid. Someone we love has a question and feels doubtful. We could take that personally. We could worry for them. We could wonder what this all means. And so sometimes we struggle to do what Jesus did with the rich young ruler who came to him. Jesus let him walk away. But the experience of everyone who was there was that Jesus loved him. And so that combination of that kind of space, it's hard for us. We're afraid that someone will walk away. Others of us are not at our best. We're arrogant, and we just say, get over it. And that's because we haven't yet suffered, or we have, and we won't look at it anymore. And that makes it hard too. And so the wonderful thing about Jesus is that he just says that be asking, be seeking, be knocking. So it's just this culture of asking, and that kind of culture is meaningful. I think so much so that the earliest Christians, they thought of the Christian community as a place that showed mercy to those who doubted. Jude, Jesus' brother, just says it plainly, show mercy to those who doubt. And you think, why would the earliest Christians have this posture toward doubt? It seems like, wouldn't they be so wore out? There's the Roman world and everything else, and now someone's doubting, But instead it was mercy. And you think, why would they show mercy? And it's plausible to think that because they themselves doubted. We know Thomas doubted, but it wasn't just him. Peter and James and John and others, Peter and John there, they don't believe Mary Magdalene when she says what she's seen. And even at that Great Commission passage, what Christians call the Great Commission, where, go into all the world and make disciples of the nations, it says they gathered to worship Jesus and some doubted. The some there is more than one. And it's the doubting, it's the group in which some doubted that Jesus is commissioning. They're worshiping him and he's commissioning them. And so it just must be they encountered some type of mercy from him, and they couldn't help but offer it to others too. But we get afraid, or we can be arrogant, and we can forget about the mercy that maybe some of us have needed too.
Thank you. I want to ask one more thing, and then we'll open it up. I'm sure we have some questions after your talk tonight. This one struck me. I have not ever thought of it quite like this, but through the course of your talk, it came to mind that doubt is pre-fall. That Adam and Eve had a doubt and acted on it a certain way, and I kind of wonder if doubt is just a part of who we are as creatures, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
That's such a great question, and there are people who will have more precision about these things than I have, but it seems that way, to be able to question, to ask our questions of Jesus, be asking, be seeking, be knocking. If you read through the biographies of those who wrote about Jesus' life, and if you just read it for the questions that are asked of Jesus, people are asking questions of him all the time, and he's welcoming them. And so, in its most basic form, a doubt is something we don't know that we can trust yet. And so that means we ask questions to find out about it. And to have that kind of question, to wonder if we can trust something, how else can we grow in faith? There is a kind of doubt that James talks about in chapter 1, and it gets misused, I'm afraid. He says those who doubt are like, those tossed by the wind, and they shouldn't think they'll receive anything from the Lord. And sometimes earnest preachers, we take that passage and we give the impression if there's ever anything you don't know or you're not sure you can trust, you better not ask about it, because if you doubt, and we get this impression of it. But I think it's just a misunderstanding where the double-minded man throughout the book of James is the person who's made doubt their way of life. It's the cynic, the cynicism rather than the honest question. And I think we'd want to say, in a sort of a trite way, doubt doesn't count you out, but it can't get you through. I wonder if that's I don't know what Melville was fully getting at, but this idea that there's a kind of doubt with a divine intuition that keeps us asking. That's an honest question like the Psalms would ask, and or Job is asking, and those kinds of doubts, meaning, how could I trust this? I don't understand this. How could this be? Where are you? Why would you do this? All those kinds of things are defended in the story of Job and defended in the Psalms. And then ultimately, like I mentioned, Jesus is taking up that question on the cross himself. And we're reminded, as Christians, we would say, Jesus died for our sins on the cross. And we're also remembering that he took up the cry of the victim on the cross. And why? Why have you forsaken me? And any one of us who have sinned receive this grace that Jesus is dying on behalf of our sin, but also, as we've been sinned against, we're experiencing his advocacy, giving voice to the way we've been sinned against, and the cry of our heart like a psalmist, why? And surely that's not a sin. That's a doubt of an appropriate kind. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's open it up for some questions from the crowd, and also I'm pointing back at Andy, who's running our live stream. If anybody has questions, you can let us know about that. We'll do our best to repeat questions for those that are listening in.
So you're talking about experiencing these seasons of doubt,
Mm-hmm.
and then finding peace or relief in some form of expression of that then in the stories that Christ gives and
Mm-hmm.
these stories that we encounter. So I was curious then, as an artist, when you go either to write your own words to speak to people who are experiencing these same things, or maybe even just in conversation, sort of what are the things that you do or the ways that you remind yourself to be speaking to those who are feeling doubt, sort of in a practical, how do I imitate what Christ does? Like, how do I do what he's doing to those who need to hear that?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. Part of it is a story like this one. Even naming these kinds of doubts, I doubt because it seems weak. I doubt because of the moral injury and trauma. I doubt because I'm offended that I have to do this. That Jesus is so hospitable to give us those kinds of doubt in the form of a story, which invites us to have room. So even the hospitality of his way of dealing with it helps me remember that. And I think the way he relates to people. So what I say, I suppose one answer is I'm trying to be acquainted with him, which just means reading the Gospels a lot. And then the second thing is, in a very practical way, is sometimes I'll write a little box. I have a little rectangle on the page, put a line through it, and I just put soft-hearted, it'd be S-H and H-H. What that means for me is soft-hearted and hard-hearted. And the woman at the well is soft-hearted. And the Pharisees scheming to kill him near the end of his life are hard-hearted. And Jesus never says, "Woe to you," to the woman at the well, or Zacchaeus, or even Peter. I mean, "Get behind me, Satan's" pretty rough, but it's not the prophetic mantle of "woe to you," And so I don't want to say "woe to you" to the woman at the well, And if I'm going to say woe, the other thing about that is the hard-hearted. It took Jesus almost 3 years before he started in with the woes like he did. So he gave those folks a lot of time and a lot of opportunity, and then finally let her rip. But it wasn't to the woman at the well or anyone like her. It was to those who were scheming. So sometimes soft-hearted, hard-hearted is sort of a shorthand way to remind myself about that. Yeah.
What have been some of the books that you found really encouraging or found that you found gave you language just during some of these seasons? Or stories or poems, any of it, just
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not good at it because my mind goes to mush because there's so many things. But it's like seasons of life. So, a certain poem by Mary Oliver, or a poem by Donald Hall or Jane Kenyon or Wendell Berry, or the Rabbit Room Substack poems. A line or a phrase will help me, and I'll jot it down and I'll go back to it. Stories, lots of stories, and trying to mention some of them. There's a line, like one story, "The Diary of a Country Priest," and I realize this is a spoiler alert.
Go ahead.
Okay, but the very last line says, "Grace is everywhere." And I'll say nothing more about the story, but in the context of the story, when you get to that line, I weep. And so that line has just become part of my life. Grace is everywhere. And songs, like I mentioned, lots of songs. And it could be a song that our friend Andrew Peterson has written. About the shoots springing up and the water coming down. Or it could be Sarah Bareilles, who doesn't, to my knowledge, is not a Christian, but tells me I can be king of the lost boys. And speaks, or tells me that if I'm out there alone, there's a satellite call coming to me to let me know that I matter. And so, those are some thoughts. Winnie the Pooh. Well, I love Winnie the Pooh and the characters there.
Maybe, I know you have kind of limited to that one story, and maybe it falls into the offense, that set of seeds. But it seems like in my experience, I find a lot of people blessing? Or like in Psalms, it seems like a lot of the times in the Psalms, the psalm writers is like, why is it so easy for these people and it's not easy for me? Why are they able
Yeah.
to get pregnant or find a spouse
Right.
or find a job? And I promised, wasn't, if I'm on God's team, wouldn't he want
Yeah.
to give me those things? And yet I see other people getting these blessings and they're withheld from me.
Yeah.
Do you find that central in your experience with people struggling with doubt?
Yes, I'd say right now, you know, for example, there's a number of folks who come to our home each week who are deconstructing their faith. We eat dinner together and then we talk. We mostly listen and enjoy them, but hear their real questions. Or I'm tempted to say, especially among younger people, but I'm sure it doesn't minimize those of us who are older too. But there's certainly a thread among younger people who have grown up in the church and who experience hardship. So the problem of evil can be very real, but also it could just be however they imagine their life, and the real struggle to be afraid of missing out, how all that converges in our cultural moment with the polarizations all around. And that can create a sense that it isn't just why would evil happen if there's a God. It's why doesn't my life smoother if there's a God? And it's no less weighty for them if a person wanted to be married but isn't, if a person is married but they wanted to have children but they can't, or they are having their first child, but what does it mean to bring up a child in this world? And heaven sounds nice, but I don't know if it seems exciting to go to heaven. And so these kinds of feelings. And so that sense of anxiety with the weeds, but it's also the sense of, really? Is this how it's, like even the best of an ordinary life would be on this side of the new kingdom? And trying to grapple with that. And I think that's very real. And isn't it wonderful how the psalmist gives us a God-centered poetic prayer and song
Permission to say that.
to say all that, and then in that case they're able to turn the corner. But when I brought all this into the house of God, it set it all back into context, and they found some kind of sturdy help from it. But in the story, there's no answer. The story that Jesus tells that we looked at ends bleakly. They withered away, and there's no turn. Now, in other stories, of course, there's a turn, but not in this story. Yeah. And for some of us, it's good to encounter a story, sort of like a book like Ecclesiastes, or a Psalm 88, where there's no turn. We're just heard in what it feels like, and Jesus is able, of course, but he's willing to tell stories like that too.
Is that maybe with Darkness is My Closest Friend? Is that 88?
88, yep, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Got a question for you?
You already mentioned a little bit that doubt can only take you so far, that you have to go beyond it. And I just want to ask more about that. Just as I know from my own life, you can almost grow to be comfortable in the sphere of doubt. That like
Yeah.
you learn how to knock, but not how to walk through the door.
Yeah.
Or you become a seeker, but in a way that keeps you there instead of going beyond that to
Yeah.
take those steps of faith. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's such a good insight and a helpful way of saying it, because I think experientially, I know for myself and for many people I sit with, the experience is I can trust my doubt. It's not necessarily that we'd put the words that way, but darkness is my closest friend. I am familiar with doubt. I know how doubt functions. I know how pain and cynicism function, these are my familiar friends. And so the thought that I would believe can be scarier because it's so unfamiliar, and it feels like it would change my identity. Like if I was it would mean if it would change the way I talk to my friends. If my friends say, "How are you doing right now?" I say, "Oh, I'm doubting." And things are hard. And then I have a friend's voice being able to say that. But try to imagine if a friend said, "So how are you doing?" I have faith. I feel hopeful. We almost don't know how to try that on, It can feel a threat to us, sometimes because we've not experienced faith expressed in a hospitable, authentic way like that. So it's hard to trust it. And so I think of it this way, the good side of cynicism is that it helps us grow wiser than we once were. We're not as gullible. We're not as naive. And so there's Ecclesiastes is sort of a wise kind of cynicism, or Proverbs calls us to a kind of discernment, But when cynicism becomes a way of life for us, then it's like, it's like we profile it. We profile faith. We have a bias against faith. We don't realize it. But if faith walked into the store, if cynicism walked into our store, we'd pay it no mind. If faith walks into the store, now we're watching everywhere faith is going. And we're hypervigilant when it comes to faith. We don't want to be duped. We don't want to be hurt. We don't trust it. And there could be a lot of wisdom in that, as we said. But the problem with that is, if it becomes a way of life, then we would never recognize the real thing even if it stood right in front of us. Because by default, we're only going to trust cynicism. You know what I mean? So that's why I've tried to say it's a cheesy preacher way to say it, right? But doubt doesn't count me out. It's important to doubt certain things, to discern certain things. But it can't get me through because it always closes the door in the end. And so it takes courage in community to believe.
Appreciate that. Any other questions? How are we doing? Yeah.
I was curious if you could just share a bit about how you have grown to know the heart of Jesus more as he's met you in your experiences of doubt, and how that's affected your response to yourself and others.
That's such a great question. Well, I suppose it's the puzzle pieces of all these things. First-hand acquaintance with reading his words, not because I have to or because I have to make sure I meet a certain quota of being delivered from that again and again, and reading about him because he's lovely. I find him lovable. I find him compelling. I find him to be unlike anyone I've ever heard of or encountered. And so to read about him in that way, and to let the Jesus as he's presented in the Bible astonish me, and not tame him. But when I don't understand or don't like something, to say that a psalm-like to him, conversation-like to him, rather than editing him. Well, I don't like that bit, so I edit that out. But instead of that, just trying to say, wow, I don't like that bit. Lord, I don't like that bit. But I don't like that bit. What do I do with that? And so that kind of relational, assuming that when I'm coming to the text, I'm coming by its means to meet with Him, and then I'll forget about that, and I'll need help. And what helps me is songs and poems and stories and people, and then people that we've heard of, like storytellers and songwriters, but people we've never heard of that are just in my life. And so, yeah. And I suppose thinking of it as a marathon rather than a sprint. I mean, the Lord could make my life a sprint, but until He does that, trusting maybe I'll have 70 years, if by strength 80, as the psalmists say. I don't know. Walt Wangren reminded us not to take that for granted. But if that's the case, then there's a long view and a lot of hope. This current scene in our story, or this current verse in my song, that isn't the last one. Yeah. Something like that.
Zach, thank you so much. I want to finish up by asking you and your wife Jessica have put together this thing, Sage Christianity. Would you just briefly tell us about that? It sounds like a wonderful resource for any of us in this room, as well as those we might know. So if you just would tell us a bit about that, I think that would be a great way to first
well, Sage Christianity is just a way of trying to create a hospitable space, like you all do here, that people could give voice to their honest questions and sorrows and anxieties and hopes and dreams, but do it in a way in which we're trying to make contact with Jesus as our wisdom. So Jesus is many things to us, and upholding all those things, our focus is Jesus as the one greater than Solomon who's here, the fulfillment of all wisdom, that He's the Savior of our sins, and He's also the Master of all reality. And I can ask Him about anything. He knows how to use an iPad. And I can ask Him about real life and try to make contact with His wisdom that way. So that's what that's about. Yeah.
SageChristianity.org.com?
Yeah, both.
Okay,
Yeah.
Either one works.
I snatched them up.
Wonderful. All right, let's thank Zach one more time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.